Why don't we get started now? Thank you for joining us here today at Shannon Law Group. We are a law firm that's located in the Chicagoland area. We decided to put on this webinar to discuss getting compensation for COVID-19 vaccine injuries. Just as a little bit of a background, Shannon Law Group is located in Illinois, and we represent a variety of personal injury litigation, both on the local Illinois level as well as the federal level. My name is Rhonda Lorenz-Pignato. I am a vaccine injury attorney with Shannon Law Group, and I dedicate 100% of my time representing those injured from vaccines. I want to, just as a little background, everyone here is muted. If you find for some reason that you've become unmuted, please mute yourself so that we can get through this. This is being recorded so that we can provide it to additional people who are reaching out to help to us in the future. There's a chat function in Zoom. If you're not familiar with it, it should be somewhere at the bottom of your screen. If you find you have a question or you need a clarification, please go into that chat function and type in your question or your clarification that you need, and those will be either responded to in live time by Brittany, who is helping us put on this webinar from Shannon Law Group, or she will just collect that question, and at the end we'll have a question and answer section, and we will address it at that time. Let's see. There we go. So at Shannon Law Group, our vaccine practice is based on one particular federal program called the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. It is a federal program, which means we can represent people all across the United States, which we do. And just to give you just a quick little background, the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program was created back in 1986. And it was meant to accomplish two things. Number one, it was meant to protect pharmaceutical companies and manufacturers of vaccines and physicians from being sued as a result of vaccine injuries. And it was also meant to create a compensation fund. That compensation fund was, hold on one second, admit some other people here. All right. So it was also meant to protect the pharmaceutical company, to create a compensation fund in a no-fault system where people who are seriously injured from vaccines can recover. Now, the compensation you can get from this program only covers certain vaccines that were put into the program in 1980s and have been added since. Since that time, COVID-19 vaccines have not yet been added to that program. So this particular seminar is not meant to be a comprehensive overview of the vaccine injury program, but if you would like that, we encourage you to look into that. And we actually offer a free book. It's not showing up on my screen, but let me do it here. There we go. So vaccine injuries, an understanding of the vaccine injury compensation program, which was written by our own Jonathan Svitak. He leads up our vaccine injury attorneys here at Shannon Law Group. And there's a few different ways you can get this book. You can get it as a free download by going to our website at shannonlawgroup.com. You can email our assistant Brittany at bpeterson@shannonlawgroup.com and provide her with your address, and she can send you a hard copy. Or you can also text the initials VICP, that's VICP, to the number 312-847-2428, and you will be given instructions on how to receive a free copy. I will give you that text number at the end of the presentation as well. So this book is meant also to be a great guide for the layperson. It's written in very understandable terms. So I hope that you'll reach out and get that from us. We are going to be discussing some key sections of this vaccine injury compensation program that we feel it's important for you to know if you are experiencing a COVID-19 vaccine injury. Many of you are here because you reached out to our firm. We get calls on a daily basis from people who are experiencing some kind of discomfort or injury from a COVID-19 shot or vaccine. And unfortunately, we've been told that at this time we're unable to assist you. And the reason for that is because of what I had mentioned earlier, that the COVID-19 shots or vaccines are not currently part of the vaccine injury compensation program. So we cannot file a claim for you in that program. But we decided to create this short seminar to explain to you, number one, there is a program that is currently set up to help people with COVID-19 vaccine injuries. And we're going to tell you a little bit about that. Number two, we're going to compare that program with the vaccine injury compensation program so you can see the difference between the two programs. And there's a big difference as far as what you can recover. And then we're going to give you some information about a bill that's currently pending in the House of Representatives, which will, I think, help to add the COVID-19 vaccine to the vaccine injury compensation program a lot quicker, as well as expand that program to allow people to have additional recovery for their injuries. And then finally, we're going to give you some really practical, useful tips on what you can do to help yourself if you are experiencing a vaccine injury, or in the future you experienced one, what you can do to help yourself in order to set up your claim in a way so that it'll be successful. So at this time, I'm going to hand things over to Jonathan. He is going to talk to you a little bit about the program that I mentioned that does currently apply to COVID-19 vaccines, called the Countermeasures Injury Compensation Program. And he's going to compare that to the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. I know there's a lot of big words and a lot of initials here, but bear with us. We're going to try to make this as simple as we can for you. Jonathan is a successful and accomplished personal injury attorney. He heads up our Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. He's the author of the book, The Vaccine Injuries, that I had mentioned earlier. And so I'm going to now turn this over to Jonathan. Give me 1 second. And Jonathan, if there's anybody else to admit, please admit them. I'm not sure whether I saw that or not.
Yeah, I just submitted a few folks here. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Like Rhonda said, we just want to go over a few of these compensation programs, some about how they're different, how they're similar, and give you kind of an idea of what you're facing if you have a COVID-19 vaccine injury. So what I'll do now is I'll share my screen here with you. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. So what I'm going to do is, as Rhonda said, is kind of go through and compare these two programs. Now, what we do is we file petitions for people in the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. And then I'm going to refer to that as the VICP going forward so that I don't have to say that mouthful every time. And what I'll do is I'll compare that to the CICP, which is what is currently set up to receive petitions for compensation due to COVID-19 vaccine injuries. So some brief background on the CICP. It's a fairly young program. It began providing compensation in 2010, and that was actually in response to the H1N1 pandemic and the influenza vaccines that were established and developed in response to that pandemic. And just like that situation, the way that the program is established is through what we call the PrEP Act. It's the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act. So the Department of Health and Human Services will issue a public emergency declaration. And that does two things. It provides immunity from liability for claims of injuries or loss due to covered countermeasures. and that liability is extended to individuals involved in basically any step of the process, from the development of these countermeasures through to the administration and use of those countermeasures. And it also identifies what the countermeasures are. So in this case, any medication, drugs, vaccines that were developed or administered or used to combat the COVID-19 pandemic are considered countermeasures. So the Pfizer, the Moderna, the Johnson & Johnson vaccines, those are all countermeasures under this PrEP Act. So not only does this provide immunity from lawsuits for medical negligence or lawsuits for medical malpractice, but it also limits where you can file for compensation to this CICP, the Countermeasures Injury Compensation Program. So a little bit of data on the CICP. Since 2010, there have been only 2,186 total claims filed in this program. Out of the 2,186 claims, only 29 have actually received compensation. And all 29 of those were for injuries due to the H1N1 vaccine. There were actually 39 claims that were found eligible, but 10 of those were without compensation because there was no loss. And we'll get to the types of compensation that you're entitled to in the CICP, but that gives you an idea that just because you're injured by a countermeasure doesn't mean that you'll get compensated for it. 361 of those claims were denied, and the rest are pending review. So that's a overlook of how many claims have been filed and how they're adjudicated so far. For COVID claims specifically, 686 claims for injuries or death due to COVID-19 vaccines specifically have been filed in the CICP. So far, 0 have been compensated, 2 have been denied, and the rest are still pending. Of those 686 claims, I went through and counted about 49 for shoulder, arm, or SERVA type injuries, and 14 for Guillain-Barré syndrome, or GBS. And the reason I identify those 2 injuries is those are the ones we see most common in our practice, especially the SERVA claims. Now, this is all data as recent as last month, August 2nd of 2021. And I can provide the link to all of this data for you. And Brittany will include it in the description to this when we post this on our YouTube channel. So by way of comparison, the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program was established in 1986 under the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act. And as Rhonda mentioned, this is a program that compensates individuals injured by particular vaccines that are covered under this program and identified on the vaccine injury table. So the vaccines that are on this table are ones that the CDC have recommended for routine administration in children and pregnant women. And under the current Vaccine Act, if we want to add a new vaccine to the table, that new vaccine must be added within 2 years of the CDC's recommendation. And this is a multi-step process, a lengthy process, from the time a new vaccine is introduced to the public to when it is added to the vaccine injury table, if at all. And I'll go through that process with you a little later. Here's some VICP data for you. Total claims since 1988. There's been a little over 24,000 petitions filed. A little over 8,000 petitions have been compensated. A little less than 12,000 petitions have been dismissed. Over the life of the program, there's been $4.6 billion paid out in compensation for vaccine injuries. Since 2016, which is when SERVA and Guillain-Barré syndrome injuries were added to the table, there's been an average of about 1,300 petitions filed per year. In 2021 alone, there's been almost 2,000 filed to date, and we still have a few months to go. From 2006 to 2015, there was an average of 472 petitions filed per year. So you can see how the addition of SERVA and GBS really spiked the number of petitions that are filed every year. And that has, if you're familiar with the VICP in the last few years, that is what has contributed to the backlog of cases that we're seeing right now, and the slow moving process of trying to get these cases adjudicated. So a little side-by-side comparison of the two programs here. And obviously the reason we're doing this, the reason we're going through this is people want to know where they should file if they have suffered an injury due to a COVID-19 vaccine. And as of right now, your only option is to file under the Countermeasures Injury Compensation Program. However, we do anticipate that at some point, COVID-19 vaccines will be added to the VICP. Problem is we don't know when, and we're not sure who may be eligible for that program if it is added to the table. Will there be retroactive coverage for people who have already received and been injured by the COVID-19 vaccine? So there are some decisions that have to be made if you're trying to determine which program to file in, and whether or not you want to file in the CICP or wait to see if it gets added to the VICP. So that's why I'm going to go through the comparison here, and just, the more information you have, the better decision you can make. So first of all, statute of limitations for these programs, which is the filing deadline. You have 1 year from the date that you received the countermeasure, or in this case, the COVID-19 vaccine, to file in that program. In the VICP, you have 3 years from the date of first manifestation or onset of the symptoms of your injury. To be safe, we usually just go by the date that you received the vaccine. But for instance, in some cases, your injury may not, the symptoms of your injury may not have manifested for 2-3 weeks after you received it. So technically, that's the date that the clock starts on the statute of limitations. Filing requirements in the CICP, you need to mail a request for benefits form to HHS, and they'll ask that you send in medical record authorizations, which would allow your providers to send your record directly to them. In the VICP, you can mail or electronically file your petition with the U.S. Court of Federal Claims. And we electronically file all of our petitions because we have a PACER account that lets us do that. If you're a pro se petitioner, most likely you're going to have to mail your petition in. Once the petition is filed, you have to supplement that petition with documentation like medical records and affidavits, and those also can be electronically filed. These are the types of injuries that are covered under each program. So under the CICP, they will compensate individuals for serious physical injuries or death. And a serious physical injury is defined as life-threatening or resulting in permanent impairment or permanent damage to a body structure. Also may necessitate medical or surgical intervention to preclude permanent impairment. In the VICP, your injury must persist for 6 months in order to file in that program. If it doesn't persist for 6 months, if it results in an inpatient hospitalization and surgery, then you're eligible to file in that claim, in that program. And in both cases, death is a covered result under the CICP and the VICP. Here's a little breakdown of the benefits or compensation that is available under each program. And before I do this, I want to make sure that we have everybody admitted here. Okay. So under the CICP, the only compensation that you're entitled to as an injured petitioner are unreimbursed medical expenses. So anything not covered by your health insurance, and that includes past or future, lost wages or earnings, and that's as a direct result of the injury. And that's also past and future. In the VICP, you're also entitled to those two things. Under the CICP, there is no compensation for pain and suffering, which is a pretty crucial element to the VICP. In the VICP, you're entitled to damages for pain and suffering up to $250,000. And in our experience, especially with these shoulder injury cases, oftentimes the bulk of somebody's compensation comes from pain and suffering, because most people will have health insurance. Most people are able to continue to work. And what we're really trying to get for them is compensation for the impact that this injury has had on their life and the pain and suffering that they went through. So to not have that as part of the CICP is another reason why you see 10 eligible petitioners in the CICP receive zero compensation because they didn't have any medical expenses. They didn't have any lost wages or earnings. They did have a vaccine injury, or they did have a countermeasures injury, but there is no compensation available to them. There's a death benefit for claims in the CICP for survivors of an individual who has died as a result of a countermeasure. And this death benefit varies every year. There is a death benefit in the VICP, and that's just the maximum of the pain and suffering award. So if you can prove that a vaccine resulted in a death, then you're entitled to $250,000, the maximum pain and suffering award. Another crucial element to the VICP is that they provide for attorney's fees and costs. So if we were to file a petition on your behalf in the VICP and get that claim adjudicated and get you compensation, our fees and our costs are paid out separately by the program. So we're not billing you for our time. We're not taking a percentage of the compensation that's awarded to you as a contingency fee. Our fees are wholly and completely covered by the VICP program. The CICP does not have an attorney fee provision. So if you're lucky enough to get some compensation through the CICP, it may be subject to a contingency fee agreement with an attorney if you had an attorney help you. Or that attorney may charge an hourly fee for their time and may ask that you reimburse expenses. The practical effect of this, of not having an attorney fee provision in the CICP, is that most petitioners don't have an attorney helping them, and they're on their own. And we'll get to why that's important in a second. But the VICP having the attorney's fees provision is so crucial, because otherwise I don't know if there'd be many successful petitions filed. So this is a big reason why having an attorney would be helpful in the CICP, because the standard of proof in the CICP is actually more difficult than the VICP, if you can believe that. So in the CICP and the VICP, there are what we call a vaccine injury table or a countermeasures injury table. And if you're able to show that you received a vaccine or a countermeasure that resulted in an injury that's specifically identified on that table within the time frame that they look for and prescribed on the table, then there's a presumption that that vaccine or countermeasure caused your injury. If your injury is not on the table, and for COVID-19 vaccines, there currently is no vaccine injury or countermeasure injury table in the CICP for COVID-19 vaccines. So that means all petitions in the CICP for COVID-19 related injuries are off table in claims. And in that case, you would have to demonstrate that your injury was a direct result of the COVID-19 vaccine. And you have to do this through compelling, reliable, valid medical and scientific evidence. That means having support for your claim through scientific literature, through scientific studies, and through your own medical records. And to try to do that without the benefit of an attorney or a medical expert is, if you were to ask me, almost insurmountable. In the VICP, we do have to prove that the injury was a direct result of the covered vaccine, but the standard of proof is through preponderant evidence, and that just means more likely than not. And similarly, we can show that through scientific literature, medical literature, and medical records. But as attorneys, we also have the ability to bring in medical experts to help us and support petitions. And there are a series of medical experts that are familiar with the VICP and who have helped petitioners through this process. But if you don't have an attorney, you may not have access to those medical experts. So that's another reason why not having the attorney fee provision in the CICP is I think devastating to a lot of those petitions and claims. In the CICP, the HHS is the decision maker. So they will decide whether you're entitled to compensation. In the VICP, HHS is the respondent. So we file as the petitioner, they answer as the respondent. Even if they decide we're not recommending compensation in this case, it's not up to them. It's up to a special master or a judge. So that judge will decide disputes between the petitioner and the respondent, HHS. There's also no ability to appeal your decision once HHS makes their determination in the CICP. You can ask them to reconsider it, but you can't go to a review judge or a panel above them to ask that they review that decision. Whereas in the VICP, if the special master decides to deny your claim, you can appeal that decision to the judges in the U.S. Court of Federal Claims. So when we look at it side by side like that, it's pretty easy to see that the VICP is the preferred program for if you had your choice to file on either of these. The standard of proof is easier to meet. You'll have the assistance of attorneys and medical experts. There's more compensation available to you. Pain and suffering being of the bulk of many petitioners' awards. And the fact that we have judges involved allows for some oversight of HHS when they're deciding these or reviewing these petitions. So that begs the question, will COVID-19 vaccines be added to the VICP? Because if they were, then obviously you'd want to file in the VICP. Here are the steps that are required for COVID-19 vaccines to be added to the VICP. First, the FDA must authorize full approval of the COVID-19 vaccine for use in children and pregnant women. From there, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices will recommend that the vaccine be added to the CDC vaccine schedule. The CDC must recommend routine administration to children and or pregnant women of the COVID-19 vaccine. Then Congress will impose an excise tax on COVID-19 vaccines any vaccine that is part of the VICP or on the vaccine injury table is subject to an excise tax. That is what funds the program. So every dose of every vaccine that is administered is subject to an excise tax. From there, HHS, through its rulemaking procedure, will add COVID-19 vaccines to the table. And HHS has 2 years from the day that the CDC recommends the vaccine to add it to the VICP. So that's a lengthy process, and there's obviously multi-step process. As of right now, I'm sure you guys are up on the news, but the FDA has authorized the Pfizer vaccine. And we would expect soon that the CDC would recommend it for routine administration in children. So we're starting to see some of these steps take place, but there's still a long way to go. And obviously the 2 years, the 2-year timeline, it hasn't even begun yet if the CDC hasn't recommended it for routine administration. So here's just a current outlook as things stand right now. As I said, the FDA has licensed Pfizer. Moderna is seeking full FDA approval as well. Pfizer and Moderna are conducting clinical trials in children in 12 and under. So eventually we would expect FDA approval of those vaccines. The Pfizer vaccine is what we're waiting for to see if it will be recommended by the CDC, and when that happens, that's when the clock will start. But we're anticipating that all COVID-19 vaccines will eventually be added to the VICP. Again, it's just a matter of how quickly these steps take place. And that 2-year clock was set forth in the Vaccine Act of 1986. As Rhonda mentioned earlier, there's been some recent legislation proposed that would change some of these things, and specifically would change that 2-year the 2-year clock. So I'm going to let Rhonda talk about this legislation and how it would impact both the COVID-19 vaccine, but also the current VICP, and make some really good changes for us and for petitioners.
Thanks, John. Let me share my screen here. Okay. All right. So what I'm going to do right now is explain to you what this new bill is that's been presented in the House and why it's important to the VICP and why it would be important to you if you are looking to file a claim in the future in the VICP for a COVID-19 vaccine injury or any vaccine injury. So it's called HR 3655, and its short title is called the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program Modernization Act of 2021, or a whole bunch of symbols, VICPMA. And it's been presented in the House of Representatives by a Democratic congressman and a Republican congressman, Congressman Doggett and Kelly. And they are looking to get more support with co-sponsors to this bill to help to push it forward. The purpose of this is to modernize and bring up to date the current VICP, because not a lot has changed in the VICP since it was written in 1986. In some injuries have been added to it, some vaccines have been added to it. But as Jonathan went over, there's a process for adding new vaccines, And some of the proposed changes to the VICP through this bill would actually allow that process to go a lot easier and a lot quicker. And that would be good, because if you're experiencing a COVID-19 vaccine injury, or you do in the future, you're going to want that added to the VICP sooner rather than later, as Jonathan went over. Here are some of the key changes that the Modernization Act would make to the VICP. As Jonathan went over, there's a 3-year statute of limitations from when you first manifest your symptoms of your injury. The new program would extend that to a 5-year statute of limitations. And that's really good for a lot of our clients who call us after the 3-year period, not clients, potential clients, but they call us after the 3-year period has expired because they've never heard of the vaccine injury program, or maybe didn't make the connection till later on that it was caused by the vaccine, because these issues can be confusing to people, and sometimes they don't discover it till after 5 years. The death claim, there's going to be no change in that. That statute of limitation will stay the same. And yeah, and so then there's also no change to the look back period. Anyway, I'll just go on from there. So this is what I think are some of the best changes, is that the pain and suffering was capped at $250,000 back in 1986, and it still is today. And this reminds me of that old movie, Austin Powers, if some of you are familiar with it, where he was a villain. It's a comedy. He's a villain. He was frozen in the 1960s and unfrozen in the 2000s. And he thought it was a big deal to hold the world hostage for $1 million. And he needed to be updated that $1 million from 1960s was not $1 million. Wasn't the same value in the 2000s. And the point is similar here. $250,000 for your pain and suffering might have covered your pain and suffering quite well back in 1986, but in 2021, it's really not updated. And in personal injury, when people file cases and they get awards from judges and juries, the pain and suffering they're awarded is based on what's going on in society today and the value of the dollar. So what this would do is it would update the pain and suffering you could get in 2021, assuming that it was passed tomorrow, and it would be maxed out at $600,000. And in addition to that, there would be yearly adjustments based on the consumer price index that would allow for it to change in the future according to the value of the dollar. Under the Modernization Act, it doesn't do any changes to the lost earnings. You can still recover lost wages. You can still recover for unreimbursed medical expenses. But the death benefit that was available, again, was capped at $250,000 in the original act, and that would also be increased to $600,000 in 2021 with yearly adjustments after that. There's no change to the fact that this program would be the payer of last resort, and that there's no change to the fact that your attorney's fees would be recovered. Some other updates that will assist all vaccine injury claims to help the processing of claims in the program would include these. Currently, as Jonathan had mentioned, the judges in this program are called special masters, and currently they are capped at 8. There's 8 special masters. So Jonathan gave you some statistics about the amount of cases in the last 10 years or so has increased quite a bit, but the number of special masters is still capped at 8. So the Modernization Act would change the number of special masters to 10, and it would take away that cap so that the amount of special masters could grow if the amount of claims that are made in the program grow. That will help tremendously in processing your claims in a more timely basis, because as of right now, there's quite the backlog and it takes a while. The Modernization Act also expands the vaccines that are covered in the program. Jonathan mentioned that the ones that are allowed to be added to the program are ones recommended for the administration of children and pregnant women, but the act would also allow adding vaccines that were recommended for adults. And that comes to mind, the first thing that comes to mind is the shingles vaccine. That's recommended for adults, but that's not covered currently under the VICP. If this Modernization Act goes into place, they could potentially add that one as well. The Modernization Act would also change the VICP to speed up the time for adding these new vaccines from that 2-year clock, as Jonathan talked about, to only 6 months. So they get on the schedule, on the table in the program a lot sooner. And then there's a complementary change that's also proposed in the House called HR Bill 3656 that would amend the tax law so that they could put that excise tax in place sooner on the new vaccines. So Jonathan mentioned that they have to get the excise tax in place in order to add to the program. This amendment, without going into details, allows them to do that a lot sooner. So this Modernization Act would make the program more robust and, in my opinion, more just as far as the compensation that you're going to get. But it would also allow for the addition of new vaccines that weren't allowed before, and then for them to be added in a more expeditious manner. So just, we've already kind of gone through this, but the steps required for the COVID-19 vaccines to be added, the Modernization Act, as I said, would include, would allow the addition of vaccines that are the FDA fully approves for adults as well as the children and pregnant women. It would allow for the recommended routine administration by the CDC to adults as well. It would make COVID-19 vaccinations be added to the table sooner rather than later. So now we're going to go into the third portion of our program where we're going to go over some tips. So if you have a vaccine injury from the COVID-19 vaccine or any vaccine injury, there are certain tips that we wanted to leave you with so that you could start setting yourself up right now to be successful in the future, to make a claim, to help your claim become more viable in that system for recovery. So Jonathan and I are going to go through these together. I'll take the first point. So the first thing you should probably do is try to get a copy of your vaccination record. Now, Jonathan mentioned that one of the injuries that we see most common are SIRVA, which are shoulder injuries related to the vaccine administration. That's what that stands for. So it's a shoulder specific injury from where it was injected. So in those cases, if you're experiencing a SIRVA injury, you're going to try to have, I would recommend, if there's an option on what type of paperwork to get for your vaccination record, try to find one that shows which shoulder it was administered to. So that would, so that it lines up with your injury. Jonathan, you want to take the next one?
Yeah, so as we talked about the statute of limitations, if you file, let's say in the CICP, after 1 year from the date that you received the vaccine, your petition or request for benefits is just going to be summarily dismissed. Same thing with the VICP. If you file after that 3-year time limitation, they won't even get to the merits of your petition. They will just dismiss it for being untimely filed. So it's really important you have those dates in mind when you are suspecting that you were injured by a vaccine, that you have 1 year to file from the date you received the covered countermeasure or the COVID-19 vaccine, or 3 years from the date of onset of your injury if you're filing in the VICP.
The next point is about reporting your injury to your doctor. a lot of people doubt themselves when they have an injury, and then they don't maybe initially report it to their doctor or don't go to their doctor quickly about it. They try to handle it on their own. It's really important that you document your injury. The VICP is extremely reliant upon your medical records. So complain a lot and complain often. That's my recommendation. Do it as soon as possible. Keep reporting your injuries to all your providers. If your doctor's records don't indicate that you're complaining about your injury, there may be an assumption that your injury has gone away. Or there are times when maybe you go to your primary care doctor and then he assigns you out to a neurologist or an orthopedist to handle your injury. So when you go back to your primary care doctor, you decide you're not going to complain to him anymore. I would suggest that you continue those complaints so that they're continually noted in the records. Emphasize when you do complain of your injury that it occurred after the vaccination, so that that's hopefully noted in the records as well. Be accurate about the dates of the vaccination when you give it to your doctor. And if you feel like your provider is not really paying attention to that complaint, you're at the doctor for maybe a variety of reasons, and for some reason they're not paying attention to that. Maybe they don't know how to line that up with a vaccine injury. You can ask them if they'll record it in their records. So that's what I would recommend you do.
And then this goes kind of hand in hand with what Rhonda was just saying, but to the best that you're able to, try to avoid significant gaps in treatment. And this more so applies to people in the VICP, but also in the CICP. If there's gaps in treatment, and this is, if you ask me, it's unfair, but what HHS and the way they interpret that is that either you're not in pain, you're not having symptoms during that time because you're not reporting it to anybody, or let's say you wait 6 months to a year to go back to your doctor to report your symptoms. They're going to suggest that that's related to some other injury or condition that occurred between your last date of treatment and that date of treatment. So to the extent that you're able to, and we all understand that people have different financial situations and insurance situations, but try to regularly treat for your injury as long as it is continuing to cause you pain or discomfort or symptoms.
Another thing that you should think about doing is getting copies of your own medical records. Sometimes, if you're in the VICP or actually either of the programs, if you're submitting your claim, it's always a good idea to have as many of your own medical records as possible. So if you're able to order them, many times they will provide them to patients at minimal or no cost. So I would look into getting some of your medical records.
You can see there's a theme here that documentation is very important in this program, in these programs. So the more documentation you have of your injury, of your symptoms, especially the onset of those symptoms, the better. So, if you exchanged texts or emails with your boss, for instance, after the vaccine, requesting some days off, that stuff becomes important, especially if there's a delay in treatment. Also, submitting a VAERS report, a vaccine adverse event reporting system. The CDC collects data from both medical providers, but also individuals who report vaccine adverse events or injuries. So if your medical provider, if you don't think that they submitted a VAERS report, you can do one yourself. And we recommend that.
And another thing that we recommend is start some sort of a log for yourself. Lots of times, if people decide they're going to file a claim a year or 2 years after their injury, it's hard to remember how things were 3 months after, 1 month after, 6 months after the vaccination. And the more details that we can have about your injury, the better we can explain it, and hopefully the more damages you can recover. So we recommend you start a log to remind yourself, make sure to have dates in there. It doesn't have to be a daily diary, but it can, maybe be a weekly or a monthly thing that you do. Make sure to include dates, maybe add in what your pain level is on a scale from 1 to 10. What's the quality of your pain? How often do you have it? And note any difficulties you're having with your activities of daily living, such as doing laundry, washing floors, doing housework. Any difficulties you're having with hobbies, not being able to go back to, you can't golf, or you were an avid swimmer and you can't swim anymore. Problems with child raising, or, lifting grandchildren. Problems you're having with your employment, if you have to take off of employment days, if you can't go back to work for a period of time, or if you're just having difficulty in certain functions. If you're in school, problems with school, anything that you can think of that your injury is creating a difficulty in your life, make a note of it so that you remember it later.
Finally, Rhonda went through and talked about this this proposed legislation, and we would invite you to contact your representative to request that they co-sponsor this bill, because it's really it's an important bill for many reasons. But number one, getting COVID-19 vaccines added to the vaccine injury compensation program as soon as possible is what we're hoping for. But also, as Rhonda went through, there's a lot of updates that are sorely needed in the vaccine injury compensation program, and this addresses a lot of those issues. So if you ask, we can even email you a template for a letter that you can address to your congressperson. And one more thing that I wanted to say here, because I think the biggest question that I would have if I suffered a COVID-19 vaccine injury is, should I file in the CICP, or should I wait and see what happens and file in the VICP? And right now, the best answer we have is it kind of depends. It depends on, number one, you have to ask yourself, if I file in the CICP, will I be successful? Knowing the standard of proof that's required, knowing that you probably won't have the assistance of an attorney, knowing that they've only compensated 29 claims out of 2,100 that have been filed in the history of the program. Are you going to be successful in that program if you file? The second question you have to ask yourself is, will I recover compensation, and what kind of compensation will I recover? Remember, you're only entitled to out-of-pocket medical expenses and lost wages or earnings. And in some cases, that might be a lot of money. But in most cases, based on our experience, it's not that much. So is it worth it to me to file in that program, knowing that from the indication we received from HHS is, if you receive compensation through the CICP, you may be precluded from filing in the VICP later. Now, if you file in the CICP and your petition is dismissed or denied, it may leave open the possibility of filing in the VICP later, because you haven't received any compensation for that injury. So knowing that carries that risk, if you are lucky enough to receive compensation through the CICP, you may be precluded from filing in the VICP, even if COVID-19 vaccines are added later to that table. So if you wait and you wait for COVID-19 vaccines to be added to the table, what we don't know now is when that's going to occur. And although we expect, because in the Vaccine Act, there is a provision, a look-back provision, whenever there's an amendment to the table, for instance, if a new vaccine is added, you'll have 2 years from that amendment to file a petition if that vaccine caused an injury to you within the previous 8 years. So if COVID-19 is subject to that provision, then when it's added to the vaccine injury compensation program, you'd have 2 years from that amendment to file your petition, assuming that you received it within the 8 previous years to the amendment. So those are the risks of waiting to file in the VICP. And the latest debate that has been discussed, amongst us as petitioners, attorneys, is will there be a legal distinction between vaccines received under the emergency use authorization, all the COVID-19 vaccines that were received before the FDA authorized full approval of the Pfizer vaccine, for example, and the fully FDA authorized vaccine? Will there be a legal distinction between those two? For instance, if you received the COVID-19 vaccine under the emergency use authorization, are you limited to filing in the CICP? If you receive the fully authorized COVID-19 vaccine, FDA approved, can you file? Will that version of the vaccine be included in the VICP? That's just a recent development that we've been discussing. We don't think that there's any legal distinction because they're the same vaccine. It's the same exact vaccine. But these are some of the issues that are circulating around this issue and this situation. So those are some of the questions that you'd have to ask yourself about which program you'd want to file in, which program you'd be potentially have more success in, or get more compensation in. And as always, we're open to discussing these things with you. We know about the 1-year timeline for most of you is coming up early next year, mid next year. So we're cognizant of that. And if you want to discuss these things with us, we're always available via phone, via email. As we get more information about these things, we will share it with you if you ask us. So obviously, we invite you to contact us with these questions.
And another thing you could do as well is you could go to our website or email Brittany at the email that you see and ask to be added to our newsletter. Our newsletter gets put out once a month, and it's got a lot of helpful tips about what to do if you're in a car accident and things like that. But we also periodically write updates on what's going on with the vaccine injury program. There's also a blog on our website that when new developments occur, we try to get some updates up there. So these are just some ways that you can keep in touch with us and in touch with some relatively current information about what's going on at the vaccine injury program. And as we said earlier, we recommend that you download or request a copy of the Vaccine Injuries book by Jonathan. And it says on your screen the different ways that you can do that, downloading it from our website, emailing Brittany, or texting VICP to 1-312-847-2428. And at this point, we are done with our presentation, but we are going to open it up to questions. Any questions in the chat? I don't see anything in the chat. If anybody has a question, if you could put it in the chat. Brittany, I don't see anything yet.
Wait a couple of minutes in case anybody has anything they'd like to ask. So we just got a question from Emily, and what she's asking is, what is Comirnaty, and that was what I was getting to with the legal distinction between the Pfizer vaccine that was administered under the emergency use authorization and the FDA approved and licensed Pfizer vaccine, which is what they're referring to when they say Comirnaty. So that is, they're giving it a different name, but it's essentially the same exact vaccine that was administered under the emergency use authorization.
seniors were the first targeted group for the COVID vaccine. We don't have, sorry, I'm coming now, sorry. We don't have lost wages. We don't have medical expenses because of Medicare, Medicaid. Will the plan for CICP to disregard seniors? I'm not sure I understand that. Do you get that?
Essentially, that is basically what has happened. If you don't have any out-of-pocket medical expenses or any lost wages, there is no compensation available in the CICP. So, if you're in that situation, then there really would be no benefit to filing the CICP because you're not getting compensated. If you believe that you have some kind of permanent injury where at some point down the road you're going to incur some kind of expenses for that, that you can relate to the injury, the vaccine injury, then perhaps there's some future medical out-of-pocket costs to you. But for the most part, you're exactly right that those folks who don't have medical expenses, who don't have lost wages or earnings, don't have any damages according to the CICP.
I did see another question here. It says, do you happen to know what type of doctor specialist would be able to diagnose SIRVA beyond primary care? First of all, we don't give out medical advice here. But beyond that, what I can say is that some of our clients with SIRVA do see orthopedic doctors, orthopedic surgeons. But it would probably depend on the type of SIRVA injury as well, the shoulder injury. Yeah, anything to add to that, Jonathan?
No, that's, yeah, the majority of our SIRVA clients see an orthopedic doctor because SIRVA is an injury to your shoulder joint. And those are the types of doctors that treat those injuries.
Yeah, there's a weird distinction that if it's a nerve injury, it's actually not considered SIRVA. So that's why I say if there's a nerve injury going on in your shoulder, it might be a different type of doctor, like a neurologist. But so to self-diagnose yourself with SIRVA might not be a good idea. It might be better to, explore that. Also, my job is physical and I have to work in spite of pain. So lost wages claim be a problem. If you didn't lose time from work, you're not going to get lost wages per se, but the pain that you experience in performing your job can be taken in consideration when determining your pain and suffering. So if you're going to work and doing something every day that causes you pain, that could add to your pain and suffering amount.
The next question here is from Mr. Williams. If someone claims they're injured after the first COVID shot, but gets the second COVID shot, does that hurt the case? Well, I think it would depend on the injury. But the fact that, for instance, if it's a SIRVA injury, if it's a shoulder injury, getting the second shot wouldn't have any impact on the case because, as we see with these SIRVA injuries, it has to do with the way that the vaccine is administered. So you can get 2 or 3 vaccines and 2 out of the 3 are administered properly. There's no issue whatsoever. And then 1 is the one, that causes the injury. So the fact that you get a second shot later that has no impact whatsoever on your injury or your health, then that is not going to impact your case. But this does remind me of an issue where, if you were injured and or suspect that it was due to the first COVID vaccine that you received, that's the date that the statute of limitations would begin for that claim.
Any other questions? If not, we can wrap this up. Thank you to everyone who has attended. We really appreciate it. We hope you got some value from this. You should receive, I believe our assistant Brittany is going to send a follow-up email to you, providing you with thank you and some information such as the sample letter that you could write your congressperson. If there's anything else you would need from us or would like from us, please feel free to email our firm. It's www.shannonlawgroup.com. You can see our email address on there. And we already showed Brittany's email address several times, so please feel free to reach out to us. Anything else to add, Jonathan?
The only thing else that I would add is if you go to the HHS website or HRSA website, you can find more information about the CICP, and they actually have a pretty responsive help desk. If you want to call them and ask some questions that maybe we didn't get to or didn't answer, you can talk to somebody there that might be able to answer some of your questions. So we'll try to do our best to include some of these links for you when we post this video.
Thank you very much, everyone. Have a wonderful day.